The moment he said it, something in me went completely still. Either your mother apologizes to me, he said, voice tight but practiced, like he'd rehearsed this in his head, or I'm done. I'm leaving. I won't stay in a relationship where I'm disrespected. The room felt too quiet after that. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the faint traffic outside my window, my own heartbeat slowing instead of speeding up. 3 years. 3 years together, and somehow it had come down to this single sentence, dropped between us like a challenge. I looked at him, really looked. His arms crossed, jaw set, eyes already braced for resistance, for negotiation, for me to shrink the way I always had. My mother had been gone less than 10 minutes. She'd stopped by to drop off soup because I'd mentioned I was coming down with a cold. An hour-long visit, a hug at the door, a quiet comment meant for me alone. Normal, ordinary, loving. And now it was an ultimatum. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself or my mother or our history. I just nodded once and said calmly, "Okay, I'll help you pack." He laughed, actually laughed, like I'd made a joke. But I was already walking toward the bedroom. As I pulled his suitcase from the closet, the same one he'd carried in when he moved into my apartment a year and a half ago, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not anger, not heartbreak, clarity. I unzipped the bag and laid it flat on the bed, folded his shirts carefully, one by one. The sound of fabric against fabric felt louder than it should have. "What are you doing?" he asked, the smile gone now. "You said you were leaving," I replied, my hand steady. "I'm helping." That's when I saw it. The flicker of panic in his eyes. The realization that this wasn't a threat anymore. That I wasn't bargaining. That I was taking him at his word. 3 years of walking on eggshells had trained him to expect compliance. He didn't expect action. And in that moment, standing in my own bedroom, packing up the man who thought he could make me choose between him and my widowed mother, I knew there was no going back to who I'd been before he said those words. Because once an ultimatum is spoken out loud, the relationship is already over. I was 31 when we met, and my life felt settled in a quiet, unremarkable way. I wasn't chasing chaos or fireworks. I had my own apartment, one I'd bought years earlier, back when the market still made sense, and a routine that felt like mine. Work, family, a small circle of people I trusted. Stability wasn't boring to me. It was earned. He came into my life without drama. No sweeping declarations, no love bombing. Just easy conversation, shared jokes, long talks that stretched into the night. After a few months, I introduced him to my mother. She liked him immediately. My mom has always been like that, open, warm, generous with her affection. She'd been widowed for 6 years by then, living about 40 minutes away, and somehow managing to be one of the kindest people I know without being intrusive. She raised my sister and me mostly on her own after my dad got sick. 2 jobs, no complaints, no bitterness, just quiet resilience. She never pushed herself into my life. She visited maybe once a month, always asking first, always brought food, always left on time. She called me twice a week at most. Normal things, loving things. But from the beginning, none of it sat right with him. At first, it was subtle. The suit my mom brought was too heavy. Her visits were a little long, even though they rarely lasted more than 2 hours. Her calls were frequent, despite being twice a week. Each comment came wrapped in reasonableness, delivered casually, like he wasn't asking for anything big. I brushed it off. Everyone has quirks. Adjustments happen in relationships. So I adjusted. I asked my mom to text before calling. I shortened visits. I started giving vague excuses when she asked to come by. I tried to smooth things over before there was even friction, convinced that compromise was just part of being a good partner. Meanwhile, he moved into my apartment about 18 months into the relationship. It made sense logistically. I owned the place outright. The mortgage was in my name. He paid me $600 a month towards shared expenses, far less than market rate for this area, about a third of what he'd pay anywhere else. I was careful to structure it as rent, not because I didn't trust him, but because practicality matters. We never argued about money. If anything, I thought that meant we were solid. But the pattern with my mother never changed. Every interaction was examined, interpreted, reframed as a slight, a passive-aggressive jab, a hidden message meant to undermine him. If she asked whether I was happy, it was an accusation. If she said I looked tired, it was an insult to his cooking. If she hugged me goodbye, it was somehow a statement about boundaries. I tried to mediate. I explained context. I defended intentions. I bent over backward to keep the peace, shrinking pieces of my own life, so he wouldn't feel threatened by a woman in her late 50s who just wanted her daughter to be okay. Over time, I stopped noticing how much ground I was giving up. Thanksgiving plans became negotiations. Phone calls turned into something I felt guilty about. I started pre-editing my words when I talked about my family, anticipating his reactions before they happened. And the worst part? I told myself this was normal. That love meant sacrifice. That choosing your partner sometimes meant choosing them in small ways over everyone else. I didn't realize those small ways were adding up, quietly, steadily, until my relationship with my own mother felt smaller, thinner, like something I had to keep apologizing for. By the time that Sunday rolled around, the soup, the hug, the comment at the door, I was already standing on a fault line I hadn't acknowledged yet. I just didn't know it was about to split. The problems didn't arrive all at once. They crept in through tone and timing, through sighs that came a beat too late, through comments framed as concern, but sharpened by resentment. After my mom left that Sunday, the shift in his energy was immediate. I hadn't even finished rinsing a mug in the sink before he said, "Did you hear what she said to you?" I paused, water still running. "Not really. What?" She said, "I hope you feel better, honey. Don't let anyone stress you out." I waited for the rest of it. When none came, I turned to face him. "Okay?" His eyes were already fixed on me. "She was talking about me." I blinked. "What? No, she wasn't." She looked right at me when she said it. "She was hugging me. She was talking to me." "No," he insisted. "She was calling me stressful. That was a dig." I felt the familiar weight settle in my chest. This wasn't new. I'd heard versions of this before, just dressed up in slightly different words. "That's a reach," I said carefully. "She probably meant work, or just life." "No, and it's not just this. Last month at dinner, she asked if you were happy and gave me this look." I sighed, rubbing my temple. The look. There was always a look. Something vague enough to be impossible to disprove, but specific enough to sting. "She asks because she cares about me," I said. "She asks everyone that." "She was implying I don't make you happy." "That's not what she said." "And when she said you looked tired, that was a comment on my cooking, like I can't take care of you." I stared at him. "She said I looked tired because I was sick." "You're always taking her side," he shot back. "There aren't sides," I replied, my voice tighter now. "She's just existing, and you're treating everything she does like an attack." "She called me controlling," he said suddenly. I froze. "What?" "Last week, when you went to the bathroom at dinner." "That's the first I'm hearing of this." "She said I have a lot of opinions about your schedule. That's code." "Or maybe she was making conversation about how I mentioned skipping the gym one morning," I said. "That's not code for anything." But logic didn't matter. It never did once we reached this point in the conversation. "You always defend her," he said. "She looks at me like I'm not good enough for you, like I'm temporary." "She brought me soup because I had a cold," I said, my patience thinning. "That's literally it." He shook his head. "You're not listening." I was listening. I was just hearing the same thing I'd heard for 3 years. A narrative where intent didn't matter. Kindness was suspicious, and my mother was somehow the antagonist in a story she didn't even know she was part of. "I can't keep doing this," he said, pacing now. "Every time she comes over, every time she calls, I feel judged, disrespected." I met his eyes. "She's my mother. She's always doing something." "No," I said quietly. "You're always reading something into nothing." That's when the air changed. His pacing stopped. His voice steadied in a way that made my stomach drop. "Either your mother apologizes to me for calling me controlling," he said, "or I'm done. I mean it. I'm leaving. I won't stay in a relationship where I'm treated like this." For a moment, I just stared at him. 3 years of explaining, of mediating, of shrinking, of choosing peace over truth. And suddenly he was asking me to choose him over my own mother, a woman who had done nothing but love me. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't about soup, or comments, or looks. This was about control. I didn't answer him right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because something inside me had gone unnervingly calm. The kind of calm that arrives when a line has already been crossed, when the argument is no longer about winning, but about recognizing what you're standing in. "Okay," I said finally, "I'll help you pack." He let out a short laugh. Very funny. But I was already walking away. I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. The air smelled faintly of detergent, familiar and ordinary, like nothing monumental was happening at all. I pulled out his large suitcase, the same one he'd brought when he moved in 18 months earlier, and dragged it onto the bed. The zipper sounded loud as I opened it and laid it flat. What are you doing? He asked, following me in. I didn't answer. I opened the top drawer of his dresser and started folding his t-shirts. Neatly, slowly, one by one. What are you doing? He repeated, sharper now. You said you were leaving if my mother doesn't apologize, I said evenly. She's not going to apologize because she didn't do anything wrong, so you're leaving. I'm helping. His expression shifted. Shock first, then confusion. I didn't mean it like that. Can you just stop for a second? I moved to the next drawer. His workout clothes. Fold. Stack. Place into the suitcase. Babe, come on, he said, stepping closer. I was upset. I didn't mean right now. You gave me an ultimatum, I replied. You told me to choose between you and my mother. I looked up at him then. I'm choosing my mother. That's not fair, he snapped. I just wanted her to acknowledge what she did. What she did, I said slowly, was bring me soup when I was sick, ask if I was happy, hug me goodbye. He opened his mouth, then shut it. I reached for my phone. His confidence cracked, urgency bleeding into his voice. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I searched for moving companies, same-day emergency moves, found one quickly, and hit call. Hi, I said. I need to schedule a move today if possible. One person's belongings from a one-bedroom apartment. He stood frozen as I spoke, eyes fixed on my hands. Yes, I continued. Today, 4 o'clock works. I gave them my address, confirmed the time, put down my card for the deposit. When I hung up, the apartment felt different, like something irreversible had just locked into place. They'll be here at 4, I said. This is crazy, he said, voice rising. You can't just kick me out. You said you were leaving, I replied. I'm facilitating that. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing now. I didn't mean it like that. You wanted me to force my widowed mother to apologize, I cut in, for having a conversation with me, for asking if I was happy, for bringing me soup. You wanted compliance, I said, not peace. His jaw tightened. I can't believe you're doing this to me over your mother. I gave you 3 years of my life. And I gave you 3 years of mine, I said quietly. 3 years of explaining, of mediating, of shrinking, of being made to feel guilty for loving my own family. I never isolated you, he said quickly. You told me not to go to Thanksgiving last year, I replied. You complained when I called her on her birthday. You made me feel bad every time I wanted to see her. He had no response. I kept packing. By the time the movers arrived at 4, most of his clothes were boxed. His bathroom items were bagged. The movers, 2 men who looked like this wasn't their first time walking into a situation like this, worked efficiently, without commentary. He cycled through tactics, anger, bargaining, disbelief. None of it worked. By 7, everything was loaded into the truck. He'd called his sister to meet him at a storage unit because he didn't have anywhere to go right now. As the movers finished, he turned to me one last time. Where am I supposed to go? You have your sister, I said. Your parents, friends. You're not helpless. I can't believe you are ending this over one comment. One bad day. It wasn't one comment, I replied. It was 3 years of you trying to erase my mother from my life. And I let it happen because I wanted peace. I paused. But you don't want peace, I said. You want control. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. At the door, he turned back. You're going to regret this. No one will ever love you like I did. I didn't hesitate. I hope that's true, I said, because this wasn't love. He left. I closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, then walked into my living room and sat on the couch. The apartment was quiet, still, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The quiet didn't feel peaceful at first. It felt hollow, like the air had been sucked out of the apartment along with him and his boxes. I sat on the couch for a long time, hands folded in my lap, staring at the wall where his coat used to hang. My chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, as if my body was teaching itself how to breathe again without permission. That night I called my mother. As soon as she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. Mothers always do. I told her everything. The argument, the ultimatum, the moving company, the speed of it all. There was a pause on the line when I finished, long enough that I worried I'd broken her heart. Then she started crying. Not out of relief, not out of vindication, out of guilt. I should have kept my mouth shut, she said. I never should have said anything about his opinions. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Mom, I said immediately, you didn't call him controlling. I know, but still. No, I cut in, firmer than I'd ever been with her. You've been nothing but kind to him for 3 years. You adjusted everything he asked. You texted before calling. You shortened visits. You brought food and smiled and tried. None of it was enough. She sniffed softly. I never wanted to come between you two. You didn't, I said. He did. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, phone warm in my hand, and felt something solidify inside me. I wasn't going to let her carry blame that was never hers to begin with. The next few days proved how necessary that resolve was. Day 1, his sister called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail accusing me of being cold, of throwing him out with no warning, of emotionally abusing him by cutting him off so suddenly. I deleted it without responding. Day 2, his mother called. I answered that one, briefly. How dare you treat my son this way, she demanded. He did everything for you. He told me to choose between him and my mother, I replied evenly. I chose my mother. That's because you're too attached, she snapped. No partner should still be running to her mother like that. No healthy partner asks someone to cut off their family to manage his insecurity, I said, and ended the call. By day 3, the messages started coming in from friends. Not mine, his. People who'd only ever heard his version of events. Most I ignored. One mutual friend message, trying to sound neutral. Hey, I don't know what really happened, but he's saying you kicked him out over nothing. Can't you guys just talk? I didn't argue. I sent screenshots instead. Messages he'd sent me months earlier. Complaints about how often my mom called. About holidays. About how, if I loved him, I wouldn't make him feel bad for not wanting to see her. After that, the friends stopped replying. On the 4th day, something else happened. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a notification from my door camera. I opened it and watched as he unlocked my apartment door. The key, a copy he'd made without telling me. I watched the footage with a strange detachment as he walked through the apartment, opening closets, checking drawers. He went through my desk papers, sat on the couch afterward, head in his hands, unmoving for nearly 20 minutes. Then he took a few things from the kitchen, plates he'd brought, some plates that were technically his, a set of knives, and a few items he clearly grabbed out of spite rather than necessity. I called a locksmith as soon as I got home. The locks were changed that night. It cost more than I wanted to spend, but the sound of the new deadbolt clicking into place was worth every dollar. When I told my sister what happened, she didn't hesitate. That's not sadness, she said. That's panic. You need to document everything. I saved the footage, all of it. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the shock finally began to fade. What replaced it wasn't regret. It was clarity. He hadn't expected me to take the ultimatum seriously. He'd expected me to bend, like I always had. The moment I didn't, the narrative shifted, from partner to victim, from control to desperation. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to fix it. I was watching it unfold from the outside. By the end of the first week, it was clear he wasn't processing the breakup. He was rewriting it. The version of events circulating through his family and social circle had nothing to do with ultimatums or boundaries. In his story, I was cold, calculated, emotionally abusive. A woman who had thrown him out with no warning because I cared more about my mother than my relationship. I didn't hear this from him directly. I heard it because the messages wouldn't stop. Friends I barely knew suddenly felt entitled to weigh in on my character. People who had never seen the private arguments, never watched me hesitate before answering a call from my own mother, never noticed how every visit came with an emotional cost. Most of them I ignored. One mutual friend tried again. He's really struggling, the message read. He says you blindsided him. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I sent screenshots instead. His words, his tone, messages from months earlier, complaints about my mother calling too often, about holidays being unnecessary, about how if I loved him, I wouldn't make him feel bad for not wanting to see her. There was no reply after that. Behind the scenes, his sister tried a different route. She called my sister twice, crying, venting, trying to find an ally. According to my sister, she spent 30 minutes insisting she didn't understand what her brother'd done wrong, then pivoted to calling my mother toxic and asking if my sister agreed. My sister shut it down immediately. I told her to stop calling, my sister said later. Hard stop. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it escalated. Midweek, I opened my mailbox to find a letter from a law office. Not a lawsuit, not a cease and desist, just a letter on formal letterhead, carefully worded, claiming he was entitled to equitable compensation for his contributions during the 18 months he lived with me. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The language was vague by design. Household contributions, shared expenses, emotional labor. The implication was clear. Pay something now or prepare for a fight. I called a lawyer that afternoon, a friend from college who handled real estate but knew family law well enough to spot nonsense. He read the letter and didn't hesitate. "This is garbage," he said. Then he broke it down point by point. He was never on the mortgage, never on the deed. His monthly payments were explicitly structured as rent. There was no cohabitation agreement. There was no common law marriage in my state, and even if there were, we didn't qualify. "Zero claim," my lawyer said. "None." I told him about the door camera footage, the copied key, the unauthorized entry. There was a pause. "Save everything," he said. "We'll shut this down cleanly." His response was brief and surgical. No legal standing. All further communication through counsel. Video evidence of unauthorized entry after keys were returned. Advisement to cease all contact. I never heard from that lawyer again. But the entitlement didn't stop. It just changed hands. His father called next. A man I'd met exactly twice in 3 years. Both times briefly. Both times polite enough to my face. His tone now was aggressive from the start. "You need to give my son what he's owed," he said. "He's not owed anything," I replied calmly. "He paid rent." "He devoted himself to you," his father snapped. "He cared for you, protected you, put you first. He helped make that place a home." "He lived there," I said, "and paid below market rent after 6 months. That's not ownership." "You're going to hear from our lawyer," he warned. "I already did," I said, and my lawyer responded. There was silence on the line. Then he muttered something about me not hearing the end of this and hung up. I did, actually. That was the last time anyone in his family mentioned legal action. What didn't stop immediately was the narrative. Coworkers began asking questions, not directly, but enough to let me know the story had spread. "Hey," one said awkwardly in the break room, "is it true you kicked him out because he wanted you to spend less time with your mom?" I looked at him. "No, he gave me an ultimatum. I declined." "Oh," he said, "that's not what I heard." "I'm sure," I replied. Truth never travels as fast as drama. I knew the full extent of it because his sister sent me a 6-paragraph text outlining my supposed failures. It included phrases like emotional dependency, weaponizing family, and heartless execution. I didn't respond. What would be the point? A few nights later, my mother came over for dinner. It was the first time she'd been in my apartment without him hovering, without subtle comments about how long the visit was lasting or what we were talking about. She stayed for 4 hours. We watched a movie. She made pot roast. She told me stories about my dad I'd never heard before. At one point, she fell asleep on the couch for 20 minutes, her head tilted to the side. I didn't wake her. When she left, she hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry you went through this," she said softly, "but I'm not sorry you're free." That hit harder than I expected. By the end of the second week, the noise finally started to fade. The people who believed his version without question drifted away. The ones who had watched the pattern over time understood immediately. One friend said it best. "He made you choose," he said. "You chose. He just didn't think you actually would." That was the truth of it. The escalation wasn't about heartbreak. It was about control slipping through his fingers, and the chaos that followed when it did. And I still hadn't reached the lowest point yet. The noise eventually died down, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was heavier than that. Once the calls stopped, once the messages slowed, and the threats fizzled into nothing, I was left alone with the aftermath. No more enemies to react to, no more fires to put out, just the quiet reality of what 3 years had actually cost me. That's when it hit. Not during the argument, not when the movers carried his boxes out, not even when his family tried to paint me as a villain. It hit late one night, sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. I realized how much of my life I had been managing instead of living. Every decision for the past 3 years had come with an internal calculation. Would this upset him? Would this start another conversation about boundaries, tone, and tensions? Was it worth the fallout? I replayed moments I'd brushed off at the time. The way I used to lower my voice when my mother called, like it was something to hide. The way I'd check the clock during visits, already preparing to apologize for how long she'd stayed. The way my chest would tighten whenever holidays came up, knowing it would turn into another negotiation. I'd told myself that was love, compromise, maturity. But sitting there alone, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I hadn't been choosing him. I'd been erasing myself. That realization hurt more than the breakup ever could. I thought about my mother, how quickly she'd blamed herself when I told her what happened, how instinctively she'd taken responsibility for someone else's behavior. I'd learned that reflex from her, the habit of absorbing blame to keep the peace. And suddenly the pattern was impossible to unsee. That night I barely slept. When I did drift off, my dreams were restless, half-finished conversations, arguments looping without resolution. I woke up with my heart pounding, the familiar anxiety still clinging to me, even though the source was gone. That scared me, because it meant the damage didn't leave when he did. The next day, I caught myself rehearsing explanations in my head for things that didn't need defending. Why I was going to see my mom. Why I hadn't responded to a text right away. Why I wanted to spend my weekend a certain way. There was no one there to demand those explanations. And yet my body still acted like there was. That was the darkest part. Not the conflict, not the accusations, but the residue. The way control lingers even after it's supposedly over. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me, suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of grief that had nothing to do with missing him. I was grieving the version of myself I'd been before I started shrinking. The woman who bought her own place without apologizing. The woman who loved her family openly. The woman who didn't second-guess every emotional reaction. For the first time, I let myself feel angry. Not explosive anger. Quiet, focused anger. Angry that I'd spent 3 years explaining kindness to someone determined to see it as a threat. Angry that I'd been so careful not to hurt him while slowly letting myself be hurt instead. Angry that I'd mistaken compliance for harmony. I didn't cry for him. I cried for myself. For the nights I'd swallowed words. For the holidays I'd cut short. For the relationships I'd softened so he wouldn't feel insecure. Sitting there, hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee, I finally admitted the hardest truth of all. If he hadn't forced the ultimatum, I might still be there. Still negotiating, still shrinking, still telling myself it wasn't that bad. That realization was terrifying. But it was also clarifying. Because once you see how close you came to losing yourself completely, you can't unsee it. And somewhere in that quiet, painful reckoning, something shifted. Not relief, not peace. Resolve. I didn't just survive the breakup, I escaped it. And now I needed to decide what to do with that freedom, before guilt or habit tried to pull me back into the role I'd finally stepped out of. I thought the worst of it was over. The legal threats had gone quiet. His family's calls had slowed, then stopped. The narrative he'd built had mostly burned itself out, leaving behind only the people who were determined to believe whatever version made them most comfortable. I was wrong. It happened in the middle of a workday. Ordinary, uneventful, the kind of day where nothing feels like it's about to tilt. I was at my desk when my phone rang, an internal number. "There's a man at reception asking to see you," the receptionist said carefully. "He says he's your boyfriend and that it's urgent." My stomach dropped, but my voice didn't change. "He's my ex," I said. "Please ask him to leave." There was a pause. "He's being very insistent." "Then please call security." I didn't go downstairs. I didn't hover by the elevator. I didn't explain myself to anyone. Instead, I opened the lobby camera feed on my screen. I watched as security approached him. He was agitated, pacing, gesturing sharply, pointing as he spoke. Even without sound, it was clear he was framing himself as the victim of a great injustice. Later, I learned what he'd been saying, that I was destroying his life, that I was heartless, that I wouldn't even speak to him. Security stayed calm, professional. They didn't argue. They didn't escalate. They simply escorted him to the door and made sure he left the building. When the feed went dark, I realized my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline, with the shock of seeing the last illusion collapse. Because this wasn't private anymore. He wasn't controlling the story through family calls or group chats. He was standing in a public space, demanding access to someone who had already said no, and the system had responded without hesitation. HR called me shortly after. They weren't annoyed, or skeptical, or inconvenienced. They asked if I was okay, if I wanted the incident documented, if I'd like it noted as a personal security concern. I said yes. It went into my file, quietly, officially. My manager pulled me aside later. He'd seen the security footage. "Everything okay?" he asked. "X issues," I said. He nodded once. "Let us know if you need any accommodations. Parking changes, entry timing, anything." I thanked him. I meant it. It felt strange, being believed without having to defend myself. A few days later, the final legal move arrived. Another letter from his lawyer. This one was different, shorter, weaker, framed as a suggestion rather than a threat. It proposed a settlement, something modest, to avoid prolonged conflict. I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment. His response was methodical and decisive. He laid out the facts again. No legal standing, no shared assets, explicit rent payments, and once more, the unauthorized entry, supported by video evidence. The letter ended cleanly. There would be no settlement. Any further contact would be treated as harassment. That was it. No reply followed. No escalation, no new angle, no more posturing. The door closed, not with a slam, but with silence. And in that silence, everything finally clicked. The ultimatum had never been about my mother apologizing. It had never been about respect. It was a test, a way to measure how much control he still had, how much of myself I would give up to keep him comfortable, how far he could push before I pushed back. When I called the moving company, I didn't just end the relationship. I ended the experiment. Everything that came after, the smear campaign, the legal posturing, the scene at my workplace, wasn't love unraveling. It was power being withdrawn. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped correcting the story. I stopped caring who believed what. The people who mattered already knew. The systems that mattered had already responded. For the first time since the breakup, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was done. And whatever consequences were still coming, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. None of them would be mine to carry. Once everything went quiet, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like fallout. There were no more confrontations, no more dramatic attempts to force a conversation. What remained was the slow, inevitable settling of consequences, most of them happening without me having to do anything at all. The legal front closed first. After the failed attempt at a settlement, there were no more letters, no follow-ups, no threats dressed up as requests. My lawyer checked in once, just to confirm nothing new had come through. Nothing had. Whatever illusion he had been clinging to, that pressure alone might make me fold, had finally collapsed under its own weight. At work, the aftermath was handled quietly and professionally. HR followed up to confirm the incident had been logged and that security had been briefed. There were no lectures, no awkward questions, no implication that I'd done something wrong. If anything, there was an unspoken understanding that boundaries had been crossed, and that those boundaries hadn't been mine. My manager checked in again, casually, making sure I felt supported. I didn't need changes or accommodations, but knowing they were offered mattered. It reinforced something I'd spent years unlearning. I didn't have to justify my discomfort to be taken seriously. Outside of work, his family made a few final, weak attempts to keep their version alive. A voicemail from his mother, calling me cold and ungrateful. An email from his father, accusing me of ruining his son's future. A friend request from his sister, sent and then quickly withdrawn. I didn't respond to any of it. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Engaging would have kept the story alive. Silence let it starve. And it worked. The messages stopped. The emails stopped. The narrative lost momentum when there was no one left to perform it for. Friends sorted themselves out in ways I hadn't anticipated but probably should have. A few people I'd considered close never reached out again. They accepted his version immediately and saw no reason to question it. That hurt, but not in the way I expected. It felt clean. The people who stayed didn't ask me to defend myself. They didn't push for details or drama. They simply adjusted, showed up when they said they would, invited me places without caveats, treated my relationship with my family as normal instead of something that needed to be managed. The contrast was stark. One evening, a friend came over to help me rearrange the apartment. We moved the couch, shifted the shelves, changed things just enough that the space felt like it belonged to me again. "You seem different," he said, stepping back to look at the room. "Lighter." "I feel lighter," I replied, surprised by how true it was. He hesitated, then added, "I never said anything before because it wasn't my place, but the way he reacted to your mom, it was uncomfortable to watch." I nodded. I didn't want to see it. "That happens," he said gently. It did, and now I couldn't unsee it. The strangest part of all was how quickly my energy returned once I wasn't spending it on damage control. I wasn't managing his emotions anymore. I wasn't anticipating reactions or softening truths. My schedule was mine. My phone calls were uninterrupted. My family wasn't a problem to be solved. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from him. Not directly, not indirectly. He faded out of my life the way people do when they no longer have access, first noisily, then all at once. And I realized something important in that quiet. I hadn't won. I'd just stopped losing. There was no victory speech, no sense of triumph, just the steady understanding that the chaos had never been mutual. It had been generated, and now, without an audience, it couldn't sustain itself. By the time the dust fully settled, his absence felt normal. Not like a hole, like space. And in that space, I could finally start turning towards something that had nothing to do with defending myself or surviving someone else's control. I could start rebuilding without watching over my shoulder. Life didn't change all at once. It softened. The apartment settled into a rhythm that felt natural again. My things stayed where I left them. The silence wasn't tense or loaded. It was neutral, restful. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending bracing myself until there was nothing left to brace for. I stopped anticipating reactions that never came, stopped rehearsing explanations no one asked for, stopped apologizing for things that weren't wrong. My mother and I fell into an easy routine: dinner together once a week, phone calls when we felt like it, not when it was acceptable. No guilt attached, no invisible timer counting down how long was too long. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she paused and looked at me carefully. "Your father always used to say something," she said. "How someone treats your family is how they'll eventually treat you." I nodded. I already knew. I just hadn't wanted to believe it. There was no dramatic closure after that, no final message, no apology waiting in my inbox. The absence stayed absent, and over time, it stopped feeling like something was missing. It felt like something had been removed. I thought back to the ultimatum, the moment that had seemed so catastrophic at the time, the fear of choosing wrong, the instinct to compromise just a little more, explain just a little better. Now, from the other side of it, the truth was painfully simple. Anyone who asks you to choose between them and your family has already made their priorities clear. Ultimatums aren't about love, they're about leverage. And when you refuse to play along, the illusion breaks. I don't regret calling the moving company. I don't regret ending it the way I did. I regret only how long it took me to recognize control disguised as concern. What I gained wasn't empowerment in some dramatic, cinematic sense. It was something quieter: autonomy, clarity, says. The kind of peace that doesn't need defending. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about choosing sides. It's about recognizing when love demands your silence, your distance, or your erasure. Healthy love doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't isolate you from the people who raised you. It doesn't force you into corners and call it compromise. And if someone ever asks you to choose, remember this: they're not asking because they're afraid to lose you. They're asking because they're afraid to lose control. And that's a choice worth making only once.